here we are back in the kiln room, and it's time to load the kiln. So there are what we call kiln shelves, and the kiln shelves are stored down below here in a nice organized way. So as we go to load the kiln, we grab a shelf, we take a good look at it and make sure that there's not any glaze that's been attached by someone else's piece from the previous firing. Ideally, the people who unload the kiln should be cleaning those shelves off. So it's their responsibility. If somebody from their project has something that's stuck to the shelf and it needs to be cleaned, it should be their responsibility. But if you are loading the kiln and you find glaze on the shelves, then instead of either don't use that shelf or clean it off, because otherwise it is going to melt further into the shelf. If somebody has a piece on top of that glazed area, it will stick their piece to the shelf even though that they didn't have any glaze on it. This is a good example of glaze left to a kiln shelf. And you can see here where it's kind of eating into the shelf, this big blob here. So that stuff should be removed. Even if you don't put a piece on there, it's going to corrosively melt and act and fuse even harder into this. So this shelf is okay. It could use a little bit more kiln wash. We'll get to that in a minute. Put that one aside. We take this one here. We have a chisel. We have a hammer. We have a little piece of silicon carbide, which is an abrasive material that we use to kind of grind. Instead of using a power tool or something, we're going to just hand grind any small particles off with this piece. And these things will be left in the kiln room here. Okay? So the other thing that's important is if you don't wear glasses like me, you should have protective eyewear on. And if there's somebody else working in here looking at what you're doing, they should either be not looking at where you're chiseling because pieces are going to fly. You could take it outside if you want. But remember, you know, there are going to be little shards of glass. Ideally, I don't have it with me today, but usually I would put a towel down here so there's a little bit of a cushion underneath this shelf. And you never want to hit straight down on a shelf. You're always going to hit at a kind of an angle like this. So sometimes I take the corner of the chisel and see how that's chipping that off of there. You don't have to hit it very hard. You just kind of see one piece almost hit me in the face there. And there's a bit of a divot in the shelf where that thing is sort of eaten away at the shelf. Maybe it's been fired a couple times, but it's still better to get it off of there. Whisk that off of there, and then you can take this. Using a corner is a terrible noise. Dust that off. And then this is kiln wash. It's a specially prepared mixture. This mixture is 50% alumina hydrate, 50% kaolin. Kaolin's a clay, alumina hydrate's a very high refractory material. You can also go to ceramic supply stores like Georgie's here in Portland, Oregon, and ask for kiln wash. We just make our own in our studio. So I have a nice healthy brush here. It's very thick consistency, that's good. And I brush the area that is now. And what the kiln wash allows to happen is if there is glaze that melts, instead of it eating into that raw kiln shelf, this is sort of like a barrier that sometimes the kiln wash will pop up. It'll just release. So there's areas of this shelf that have not been washed in a while. This white area has been washed. This manila tan area is areas where there is not wash. You don't have to necessarily wash the whole shelf, but just wash the areas that kind of are raw open areas. And then it dries fairly rapidly because this is a very absorbent surface. So here's our newly prepared, cleaned of glaze. and kiln wash shelf. We only do one side of the shelf. This back side is not washed. You're always going to use the white side, the kiln wash side up. If you start firing, if you wash both sides or fire the wash side down, there's a chance that that wash can chip off just in firing, just an expansion, contraction, and fall into your piece, and then have this little white, dry, chunky thing on there, which is not usually desirable. So we just wash the upside of the shelves, and that's the side that's always going to have the wear on it. Next step, I'm going to look in the kiln is the next step. And if, like I looked in here when I first got here today, and in the bottom of the kiln was somebody's chunks of a piece that either chipped off or blew up or something, and this has glaze on it. And if that's sitting loose on a shelf, that's going to like fuse and stick to the shelf too. So if you see that kind of stuff, take a whisk broom or just go in there and pick it up, but essentially clean the floor of the shelf off if something is blown up or there's fragments in there. Especially if it gets inside the kiln elements. If one of these sort of blew and went inside the kiln elements, they're going to act as like a corrosive thing on that kiln element, which is like an electric heating element, and it's going to eat through that and then probably ruin the life or cut back drastically on the life of the kiln element. So proper maintenance again. All right, so we'll be ready to fire to load the kiln in a minute.